The crystal chandeliers of the Volkov ballroom hummed with a low, expensive vibration, mirroring the practiced laughter of the city's elite. Maya stood near the velvet curtains, her hands folded over her green maid's vest. She was invisible to the men in tailored suits, and the women dripping in diamonds, which was exactly how she liked it. Her only focus was 6-year-old Leo, who was currently hiding behind a floral arrangement, bored by the speeches. Then, the world slowed down. A tiny, blood-red dot appeared on the white silk of Leo's collar. It danced upward, settling right over his heart. Maya's breath hitched, a cold shock of adrenaline turning her blood to ice. She looked toward the mezzanine and saw the glint of a barrel protruding from a black backpack. The bodyguards were looking at the entrance. Victor was busy shaking hands with a senator. No one saw the predator. No one but the maid. "Leo, get down!" Maya screamed, but the boy only looked up, confused. She didn't calculate the distance. She didn't think about her own life or the fact that she was a nobody in a room full of somebodies. She lunged. Her sneakers skidded across the polished marble as she threw her body through the air, wrapping her arms around the small boy just as the first suppressed crack echoed through the hall. The first bullet tore into her shoulder, the force spinning her around. The second caught her in the side, a white-hot iron brand that stole the air from her lungs. As they hit the floor, Maya curled herself into a ball, tucking Leo's head against her chest, shielding his small frame with every inch of her own. The third bullet struck her back. Silence fell over the room for a heartbeat before the screaming began. "Maya?" Leo's voice was small and muffled against her vest. "Maya, you're squishing me." She tried to answer, but her mouth felt filled with copper. She squeezed him tighter, her fingers trembling as she felt the warmth of her own blood soaking into her uniform. Above her, the room was a blur of motion. Victor's deep, commanding voice roared over the panic, followed by the heavy boots of his security team swarming the stairs. Victor reached them in seconds. He dropped to his knees, his expensive suit ruining itself in the red pool spreading across the floor. He reached out, his hands shaking, a sight no one in the underworld had ever seen. He tried to pull Leo away, but Maya's grip was a vice. Even in her fading consciousness, her instinct was to protect. "It's me, Maya. It's Victor," he whispered, his voice uncharacteristically thick. "He's safe. You saved him. Let him go." Only then did her muscles relax. Victor pulled the sobbing boy into his arms, checking him frantically for injuries. Leo was spotless, saved by the human shield who had taken the hits meant for him. Victor looked down at Maya. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes flickering as she struggled to stay present. The socialites were huddled in the corners, some filming with their phones, others looking on with a mix of horror and disdain. To them, she was a disposable employee who had simply fulfilled a tragic duty. But as Victor looked at the 3 bullet wounds marking her body, something shifted behind his dark eyes. He didn't wait for the paramedics. He scooped Maya up into his arms, ignoring the blood staining his shirt, and stared at his head of security. "Clear the path to the hospital," Victor commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, newfound clarity. "If she doesn't make it, this city burns. And if she does, she's never going back to that kitchen again." Maya's head fell against his chest, her consciousness slipping away to the rhythm of the man's racing heart. The heart she had just discovered was hidden beneath the ice. The alarm clock on the small bedside table buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, long before the sun had even thought about touching the skyline of the Volkov estate. Maya rose in the dark, pulling on her stiff, starch-scented green uniform. In a house that felt more like a fortress of glass and cold marble, she was part of the machinery, the silent gears that kept the luxury running without ever being heard. And her day always began in the kitchen, preparing a tray that no one ever thanked her for. She knew exactly how Victor liked his coffee. Black, scalding, and placed on the edge of his mahogany desk exactly 5 minutes before he entered the room. When he did walk in, He was a whirlwind of expensive cologne and whispered commands into a sleek cell phone. He never looked at her. To him, Maya was just a shadow that moved the curtains and polished the silver. She was a line item on a budget, a presence as functional and unremarkable as the air conditioning. But the true heart of Maya's day began on the second floor, in the room at the end of the long, lonely hallway. "Wake up, little lion," Maya whispered, gently shaking the shoulder of 6-year-old Leo. The boy scrambled up, his messy dark hair sticking out in every direction. In a house where his father spoke in barking orders and his nannies were changed every 3 months for being too strict, Maya was his only constant. She was the one who knew he hated the crusts on his toast. She was the one who tucked extra chocolate into his lunchbox when he had a bad dream. "Is Dad coming to breakfast today?" Leo asked, his voice hopeful but small. Maya felt a familiar pang of sadness. She knew Victor was already halfway to a meeting across town, or perhaps he was in the study, too buried in ledgers and power plays to notice his son's empty chair. She reached out, smoothing Leo's hair with a hand that was rough from cleaning chemicals, but soft in its touch. "He's very busy protecting the kingdom today, Leo," she lied gently, her eyes warm and encouraging. "But that means you and I get to have a secret mission. And we're going to see how many hidden gems we can find in the garden before your tutor arrives." Throughout the morning, Maya moved between two worlds. In one, she was the invisible girl, scrubbing the residue of $1,000 dinner off the floor while Victor's associates walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture. They talked about millions of dollars and lives ruined, never imagining the girl on her knees could hear every word. In the other world, she was Leo's hero. She spent her meager break time mending a tear in Leo's favorite stuffed bear, her needle moving with practiced grace. When Leo fell and scraped his knee in the hallway, it wasn't the high-priced security guards or the butler who knelt in the dirt. It was Maya. She didn't just clean the wound. Evening approached, and the house began to bustle with preparations for the grand gala. Maya found herself pushed further into the background. The head housekeeper snapped at her to move faster, and a passing guard bumped her shoulder without an apology. She didn't complain. She just watched Leo from a distance, making sure he was dressed in his tiny tuxedo. She saw the way the boy looked toward his father, craving a single nod of approval that never came. Maya caught Leo's eye and gave him a small, secret thumbs up from the corner of the room. A tiny smile broke across the boy's face, and for a moment, the coldness of the Volkov mansion didn't matter. Maya might have been invisible to the world, but to this one little boy, she was the only person who truly saw him. She didn't need the diamonds or the recognition, she just needed to keep the little lion safe. The Volkov estate transformed into a fortress of gold and glass as the sun dipped below the horizon. Black SUVs lined the driveway, depositing the most powerful men and women in the city onto a red carpet that looked like a streak of fresh paint against the white marble. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume. Maya moved through the crowd like a ghost in a green vest, carrying silver trays of champagne that cost more than her yearly salary. To the guests, she was just a moving part of the scenery, a convenience they didn't need to acknowledge. But Maya was a master of observation. From her position near the grand staircase, she saw the forced smiles of rivals and the way Victor stood at the center of it all, a king in a tailored tuxedo. He looked untouchable, his presence commanding the room, yet his eyes never strayed toward the corner where Leo sat on a velvet bench, swinging his legs and looking lonely despite the grandeur. As the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. Maya noticed a group of Victor's top security men whispering urgently near the kitchen entrance. Their faces were tight, their hands hovering closer to the holsters hidden beneath their jackets than they had been an hour ago. She caught fragments of a conversation as she passed by with a tray of empty flutes, words like breach, intercept, and contract. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning settled in her chest. There were rumors of a hit, a whisper that someone wanted to strike at the heart of the Volkov Empire tonight. Maya's eyes immediately went to Leo. The boy was now playing near a large floral arrangement, hidden from his father's direct line of sight by a pillar. She began to move toward him, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. That's when she saw him. Near the service entrance, a man dressed in a waiter's uniform stood perfectly still. He wasn't carrying a tray, and he wasn't looking at the guests. He was staring at the mezzanine above. What caught Maya's eye wasn't his face, which was shadowed by a low-hanging chandelier, but the heavy black backpack slung over one shoulder. It was bulky and out of place in a room where even the staff were expected to look sleek and streamlined. The man didn't move like the other servers. He had a calculated, heavy gait as he began to slip toward the back stairs. Maya slowed her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the nearest security guard, a man named Marcus who usually treated her with a modicum of respect, but he was busy scanning the front entrance, distracted by a late-arriving senator. Maya looked back at the waiter. He had reached the stairs and was unzipping the side of the backpack just enough to reveal a flash of cold, dark metal. Her breath hitched. She looked at Victor, who was laughing at a joke made by a business partner, completely unaware that a predator had entered his home. She looked at Leo, who was blissfully chasing a fallen gold ribbon across the floor. She knew she should run for help, but there wasn't time. The man with the backpack was already halfway up the stairs to the mezzanine, a position that gave him a clear, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom floor, and a direct line of sight to the little boy in the tuxedo. Maya set her tray down on a side table, her hands trembling. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have a title, but she had a clear view of the disaster about to unfold. Ignoring the rules that kept her in the shadows, Maya began to weave through the crowd, her eyes locked on the red dot that was about to change everything. The music from the string quartet seemed to warp and fade as Maya pushed through the wall of silk and perfume. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Up on the mezzanine, the man in the waiter's uniform had stopped. He wasn't looking at the vault or the jewelry. She saw the cold, mechanical glint of a suppressed weapon as it cleared the fabric. The world around her remained oblivious. Victor was mid-sentence, his back turned to his son, his mind occupied by $1 million merger. The security guards were scanning the heavy oak doors at the front, expecting a frontal assault. No one was looking up. Then, the red dot appeared. It was a tiny, flickering speck of light, like a blood-red insect crawling across the white silk of Leo's collar. It moved upward, settling with terrifying precision right over the boy's heart. Maya didn't scream. There wasn't enough air in her lungs for a sound. She knew that by the time she cried out, it would be too late. She lunged. Maya's sneakers, the cheap rubber-soled shoes she wore for 12-hour shifts, gripped the polished floor as she threw herself into a sprint. She didn't think about the physics of the bullet or the fragility of her own skin. She only saw Leo, small and vulnerable, standing in the center of a target. "Leo," she finally gasped, her voice a ragged whisper. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with confusion as his favorite maid came flying toward him. Maya didn't stop to explain. She reached him just as a dull, mechanical thud echoed from the balcony above. The first bullet struck her high in the shoulder. The impact felt like being hit by a speeding car. It spun her body, but she used the momentum to wrap her arms around Leo, pulling his small frame tight against her chest. She twisted her torso, putting her back to the mezzanine, creating a human wall between the lead and the child. Bang! The second shot tore into her side, a white-hot iron brand that scorched through her green vest. Maya's knees buckled, but she refused to fall yet. She squeezed Leo tighter, burying his face in her neck so he wouldn't see the horror unfolding. Bang! The third bullet found her back, just below the shoulder blade. The force finally sent them both crashing to the marble floor. Maya felt the cold stone against her cheek and the warm, terrifying dampness of her own blood soaking into her uniform. Her vision began to fray at the edges, turning gray and hazy. The ballroom erupted. The silence was shattered by screams and the sound of heavy boots. Maya could hear Victor's voice, a raw, primal roar of Leo that drowned out the panic of the socialites. Maya? Leo's voice was small and muffled against her chest. Maya, you're hurting me. Why are we on the floor? She tried to speak, to tell him that he was okay, but her mouth felt filled with copper. She couldn't move her arms, yet she willed them to stay locked around him. She was a shield, and a shield didn't break until the danger was gone. Through the blur, she saw a pair of expensive Italian leather shoes skidding to a halt in front of her. Victor dropped to his knees, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He reached out, his hands trembling as he touched the blood-soaked green fabric of her vest. For the first time in her life, the most powerful man in the city was looking at her. He wasn't looking through her or past her. He was seeing her. Let him go, Maya, Victor whispered, his voice cracking. He's safe. I have him. Only when she felt Victor's strong arms slide beneath the boy did Maya finally let her muscles relax. Her grip uncurled, and her world went dark, the last thing she felt being the frantic, steady beat of the little boy's heart against her own. The sterile smell of the hospital hallway was a sharp contrast to the expensive lilies of the ballroom. Victor sat in a hard plastic chair, his head in his hands. His tuxedo jacket was gone, and his white shirt was ruined, stained dark with Maya's blood. For the first time in his life, the man who owned half the city felt completely powerless. He had millions in the bank, an army of soldiers at his command, and connections that reached the highest levels of government, but none of it mattered here. None of it could sew up the holes in a girl who had nothing but a green vest and a heart too big for her own good. Through the glass window of the intensive care unit, he watched the scene that was breaking his heart. Maya lay motionless, hooked up to a rhythmic symphony of beeping machines and transparent tubes. And there, sitting on the edge of the oversized hospital bed, was Leo. The boy hadn't cried since they arrived. He simply sat there, his tiny hand gripped firmly around Maya's pale finger. When the nurses tried to move him to a private waiting room, Leo had screamed with a ferocity Victor had never seen. He had refused food, water, and even his favorite toy. He only wanted Maya. Victor stood up and walked slowly to the door, his boots silent on the linoleum. He watched his son lean over and whisper something into Maya's ear. It was a sight that made the ice around Victor's heart crack. He realized then that he had spent years providing Leo with the best of everything, the best tutors, the best clothes, the best security. But he had failed to provide the one thing the boy actually needed. He had been a provider, but Maya had been a parent. He thought about all the times he had walked past her in the hallways of his home. He had seen her as a shadow, a tool used to keep his life tidy. He had never once asked her name or where she came from. He had assumed that loyalty was something you bought with a steady paycheck and a non-disclosure agreement. But as he looked at the 3 bandages covering Maya's small frame, the truth hit him like a physical blow. His high-paid bodyguards had been looking for a threat to his business. His associates had been looking for a way to climb the social ladder. Only the invisible girl had been looking at his son. She hadn't jumped in front of those bullets because it was her job. She had done it because she loved Leo with a purity that Victor didn't think existed in his dark world. His money hadn't stopped the assassin. His power hadn't detected the red dot. It was Maya's heart, the heart of a maid he had treated as a ghost, that had saved the only thing in the world he truly cared about. Victor stepped into the room, his shadow falling across the bed. Leo looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce. "Don't take her away, Dad," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "She's the only one who stays." Victor reached out, placing a heavy hand on his son's shoulder, but his eyes were locked on Maya's face. She looked so fragile. Yet she was the strongest person he had ever met. He felt a surge of protectiveness he couldn't explain. He wasn't just grateful, he was changed. The cold, calculating man who walked into the ballroom that night was gone. In his place stood a father who realized he owed his son's life to a woman the world considered poor. "I'm not taking her anywhere, Leo," Victor promised, his voice low and thick with emotion. "From now on, she stays with us. Forever." He sat down in the chair next to the bed, reaching out to touch the cold metal of the bed rail. He didn't care about the gala, the lost business, or the rivals he had to hunt down. In that quiet, beeping room, Viktor Volkov made a silent vow. He would find whoever did this. But first, he would make sure the girl who saved his family finally had a family of her own. The quiet hum of the hospital room was shattered by the sharp click of designer heels against the tile. The door swung open, and Genevieve swept in, smelling of expensive lilies and looking perfectly polished in a silk dress that cost more than Maya would earn in 5 years. She was Victor's primary business partner and, in the eyes of the high society tabloids, the woman most likely to become the next Mrs. Volkov. Victor didn't look up. He remained in the chair beside the bed, his fingers laced together, his gaze fixed on the steady rise and fall of Maya's chest. Leo had finally fallen asleep in the corner chair, his small hand still reaching toward the bed even in his dreams. "Victor, darling, thank goodness," Genevieve sighed, her voice a practiced melody of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. She leaned over to kiss his cheek. "When we have 3 mergers on the line, and the board is in a complete panic, we have 3 mergers on the line and the press is having a field day with the security breach at the gala. We need to release a statement and get you back to the office." "I'm not leaving," Victor said, his voice like grinding stones. Genevieve rolled her eyes, moving toward the foot of the bed. She gestured vaguely at Maya's unconscious form as if she were discussing a piece of broken equipment. "I understand this was a mess, but really, Victor, sitting here in a public hospital is bad for the brand. We've sent a generous bonus to the girl's bank account. She's a maid. This is practically what she's paid for. And it was her job to ensure the safety of the household in an emergency." Victor's head snapped up. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged with a dangerous electricity. Her job? "Well, yes," Genevieve continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in Victor's eyes. She pulled out a slim gold compact to check her lipstick. "It's tragic, of course. But let's be realistic. These people are replaceable. We can hire 10 more just like her by tomorrow morning." She did what any employee would do to protect the family assets. "Now, can we please focus on the crisis management? My car is waiting downstairs." Victor stood up slowly. He was a head taller than Genevieve, and the shadow he cast seemed to swallow her whole. The snake in the grass had finally bared its fangs, showing the cold, transactional heart that Victor used to think was a sign of strength. Now, it only disgusted him. "A family asset?" Victor whispered, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than a shout. "She took 3 bullets meant for my son. She stood where my guards wouldn't. She bled while you ran for the coat check." "Victor, don't be dramatic," Genevieve scoffed, though she took a step back. "She's a servant. She was lucky to be there too." "Get out," Victor interrupted. Genevieve blinked, her mouth hanging open. "Excuse me?" "Get out of this room, get out of my hospital, and get out of my life," Victor said, his voice rising with a cold, controlled fury. "You talk about these people as if they are furniture. This woman has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire bloodline. And if I ever hear you speak her name with anything less than absolute reverence, I will ruin everything you've ever built." "You're choosing a maid over me? Over our partnership?" Genevieve's face twisted in a mask of shock and wounded pride. "I'm choosing the woman who saved my world over the one who only cares about the furniture in it," Victor replied. He stepped toward her, his eyes blazing. "Now leave, before I have security drag you out like the intruder you are. Genevieve scrambled for her purse, her heels clicking frantically as she retreated toward the door. She tried to maintain her dignity, but the look of pure terror on her face told a different story. As the door slammed shut behind her, the silence returned to the room, but the air felt cleaner. Victor turned back to the bed. He looked at Maya's pale, peaceful face, and then at his sleeping son. He realized then that he didn't just want Maya to be okay. He wanted her to be the person who sat in those designer dresses. He wanted her to be the one the world looked up to. He leaned down and gently touched her hand. His heart finally fully thawed. "You aren't a servant, Maya," he whispered. "You're the heart of this house, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows it." The smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic, hollow ticking of a clock were the first things to greet Maya as the heavy fog of sleep began to lift. Her body felt like it was made of lead, and a sharp, throbbing heat radiated from her shoulder and back. For a long moment, she didn't know where she was. She remembered the gold ribbons of the ballroom, the terrifying red dot, and a sudden, filtering through half-closed blinds. As her vision blurred into focus, she saw a shadow sitting beside her. It was Victor. He looked different. His jaw was covered in dark stubble. His eyes were bloodshot, and he wasn't wearing the armor of a three-piece suit. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for days. Maya's throat felt like it was full of sand. She tried to swallow, but it hurt. She shifted slightly, and a gasp of pain escaped her lips as the movement pulled at the stitches in her side. Victor was on his feet in an instant. He leaned over her, his hand hovering near hers as if he were afraid he might break her if he touched her. "Maya? Can you hear me?" She looked up at him, her mind racing through the chaos of her last memory. She didn't think about her medical bills. She didn't think about her ruined uniform, and she didn't even think about the fire burning in her own flesh. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his shirt. "Leo," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. She coughed, the effort sending a fresh wave of pain through her chest. Is Leo okay? Did they hurt him?" Victor froze. He had spent the last 48 hours listening to doctors talk about lung capacity, infection risks, and recovery timelines. He had dealt with angry board members and security failures. But he hadn't expected this. This girl, who had nearly died and was surely waking up in world-shattering pain, hadn't asked for water. She hadn't asked what happened to her. Her first thought, her very first breath of consciousness, was spent on the safety of his son. A lump formed in Victor's throat that he couldn't swallow away. He took her hand in both of his grip firm and warm. "He's fine, Maya. He's perfect. Not a scratch on him because of you." Maya's eyes closed briefly, and a single tear tracked through the pale dust of her cheek. A small, weak sigh of relief escaped her. "Good," she breathed. He was so scared." "He's been right here," Victor said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide anymore. He gestured to the small sofa where Leo was curled up, fast asleep under a heavy wool blanket. "He wouldn't leave your side. I had to practically bribe him to let the nurses check your vitals." Maya looked over at the sleeping boy, and a tiny, genuine smile touched her lips. Seeing him safe was better than any morphine the doctors could give her. She looked back at Victor, noticing for the first time how intensely he was watching her. There was a look in his eyes she had never seen before, not for his business partners, not for his socialite girlfriends, and certainly not for a maid. It was a look of profound, humbled reverence. "You should be resting," Victor whispered, brushing a stray hair away from her forehead. "You don't have to worry about anything ever again. Not the house, not the work, not the danger. Do you understand me?" Maya blinked, confused by the weight of his words. "But the floors, the gala mess. I have to. The only thing you have to do is heal, Victor interrupted gently. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a solemn vow. You saved my life by saving his. I spent my whole life thinking I had to buy loyalty. I was wrong. I was blind. You gave us everything. And I'm going to spend the rest of mine making sure you're the one being looked after. Maya didn't quite understand the shift in the world around her, but as Victor held her hand, she felt a sense of safety she had never known. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one doing the protecting. She drifted back toward sleep, knowing the little lion was safe and that, for some reason, the king was standing guard. The blue glow of the moonlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long skeletal shadows across Maya's bed. She was drifting in a medicated haze, her breathing shallow but steady. Victor sat in the darkness of the corner, his eyes never leaving the door. He had sent Leo home with his most trusted commander an hour ago, sensing a heaviness in the air that his years in the underworld had taught him to fear. He knew how these men worked. They didn't just fail a mission and disappear. They cleaned up their messes. And Maya was the biggest mess they had. She was a witness who had seen the shooter's face on the mezzanine, and in their world, a witness was a loose thread that had to be cut. A faint click echoed from the hallway, the sound of a magnetic lock being bypassed. Victor stood up slowly, his movements silent and fluid. He didn't reach for his phone to call the guards at the end of the hall. He knew if they had made it this far, his outer perimeter had already been compromised. He moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the cold wall, his hand sliding beneath his jacket to find the grip of his weapon. The door creaked open just a fraction. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across the floor, illuminating a pair of heavy tactical boots. A man slipped into the room, dressed in the dark navy scrubs of a surgical tech, but his face was obscured by a medical mask that sat too high. In his hand, he gripped a heavy silencer-equipped pistol, aimed directly at the shape in the bed. Before the assassin could level his sights, Victor lunged. He didn't fire. The noise would wake Maya and bring a swarm of confused nurses into the line of fire. Instead, he slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him against the doorframe. The assassin gasped, trying to bring the gun up, but Victor grabbed his wrist, twisting it with a sickening pop until the weapon clattered to the floor. The struggle was brief and brutal. Victor wasn't fighting like a businessman or a boss. He was fighting like a man protecting his home. He delivered a sharp, crushing blow to the man's throat and followed it with a knee to the solar plexus that folded the assassin in half. As the man slumped to the floor, gasping for air, a second figure appeared in the doorway. Victor didn't hesitate. He kicked the heavy hospital door shut, the metal latch clicking home with finality. He turned to the second attacker, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. "You picked the wrong room," Victor hissed. The second man pulled a knife, the blade shimmering in the dim light. He lunged, but Victor stepped inside the strike, catching the man's arm and slamming him into the heavy medical monitor beside the bed. Glass shattered, and sparks flew, but Maya remained asleep, her medication holding her in a deep, peaceful dark. Victor gripped the man by the throat, his fingers digging into the carotid artery. "Who sent you?" Victor demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The man struggled, his face turning a deep purple, but he said nothing. Victor realized it didn't matter. He knew the names of his enemies. What mattered was the message he was about to send. He subdued the man with a final, decisive strike and stood over the two unconscious figures, his chest heaving. He looked over at Maya. She hadn't even stirred. The woman who had taken 3 bullets for his son deserved to wake up in a world where she never had to be afraid again. Victor pulled out his radio, his voice calm and deadly. "Clean up in room 412, he said, "and tell the team to double the guard. From this moment on, anyone who isn't family doesn't even get on this floor. If a fly lands on her window, I want it neutralized." He walked back to the chair beside Maya's bed, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He reached out and gently tucked the blanket around her shoulder, covering the bandages. He had spent his life building a kingdom of fear, but as he sat there in the quiet room, he realized he was finally building something worth defending. The morning sun broke through the hospital blinds in long golden slashes, finally chasing away the shadows of the night's violence. Maya was sitting up, propped against a mountain of pillows, her face pale but her eyes bright. Leo was perched on the edge of the bed, showing her a drawing he had made of a knight in a green vest fighting off a dragon. The room felt peaceful, a small island of warmth in a sea of cold marble and steel. Victor stood in the doorway watching them. He had showered and changed into a fresh black shirt, but the intensity in his gaze hadn't faded. He looked at the girl who had arrived at his estate with nothing but a suitcase and a willingness to work, and he realized that she had become the only thing holding his world together. He cleared his throat, and Leo looked up, sensing the change in the air. "Leo, why don't you go find the nurse and ask for that strawberry jello you like?" Victor suggested gently. The boy nodded, sensing his father's seriousness, and squeezed Maya's hand one last time before darting out of the room. Victor closed the door behind him and walked slowly toward the bed. He didn't sit in the chair this time. He stood right beside her, looking down at the small woman who had shown more courage than 100 of his soldiers. "Maya," he began, his voice surprisingly soft. "I spent the night thinking about the person I was before that gala. I thought my wealth made me powerful. I thought my name made me respected. But when I saw you on that floor, I realized I was just a man with a lot of money and a very lonely son." Maya looked down at her lap, her fingers twisting the edge of the hospital sheet. "I was just doing what I had to do, Mr. Volkov. Leo he's everything." "Don't call me that," Victor said, moving closer until he could take her hand. Her skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold life he had led for so long. "And you weren't just doing anything. You did what I failed to do. You loved him, without expecting anything in return." He leaned down, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering sincerity. "I told you that you would never go back to that kitchen. I meant it. You will never clean another floor, and you will never have to hide in the shadows of my house again. But it's more than that, Maya. My world is dark. It's full of people who want things from me, people who fear me, and people who would betray me for a cent. But you are the light. And I realize now that I can't let that light leave." Maya's breath hitched. "I don't understand." Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't get down on one knee. His wounds from the night before made him stiff, and his pride was of a different sort, but he held the ring out with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be. Inside was a diamond that caught the sunlight, turning the room into a kaleidoscope of colors. "I don't want a maid, and Leo doesn't want a nanny," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "We want you. I want you to be my wife. I want you to be the mother of my son in every way that matters. I want the world to know that the woman who saved the Volkov family is the heart of it." Maya looked from the ring to Victor's face. She saw the raw vulnerability there, the silent plea of a man who had everything but was finally asking for the one thing he couldn't buy. She thought about her life of invisibility, of the cold mornings and the quiet nights. Then she thought of Leo's smile and the way Victor was looking at her now, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever found. "Yes," she whispered, a small, tearful laugh escaping her. "Yes, Victor." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He leaned down and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead. The invisible girl was gone. In her place sat the future queen of a kingdom that was finally beginning to feel like a home. The heavy iron gates of the Volkov estate swung open, but this time, Maya wasn't arriving in the back of a staff van. She sat in the passenger seat of Victor's private car, her hand resting comfortably in his. A month had passed since the night at the hospital, and while the scars on her shoulder and back would always remain, the girl who had once walked these halls with her head down was gone. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the entire household staff was lined up on the marble steps. There was a palpable tension in the air. Many of them remembered Maya as the girl who scrubbed the baseboards. The head housekeeper, who had once snapped at her for being too slow, stood with a pale face and trembling hands. They didn't know what to expect from the new Mrs. Volkov. Victor stepped out and opened Maya's door, offering his hand with a level of devotion that silenced the garden. Maya stepped out, dressed in a soft, elegant, cream-colored dress. She looked radiant, but as her eyes swept over the staff, there was no coldness or thirst for revenge in her gaze. "Welcome home, Maya," Victor whispered, his arm sliding around her waist. Leo came sprinting out of the front doors, bypassing the formal greeting entirely. "Maya, you're back." He tackled her in a hug, and she caught him with a laugh, mindful of her healing side. She knelt on the stone, ignoring the fact that her expensive dress was touching the ground, and kissed the boy's forehead. "I told you I wouldn't be gone long, little lion," she said, her voice warm and steady. As they walked inside, Maya stopped in front of the head housekeeper. The older woman bowed her head, waiting for a reprimand that she felt she deserved. Instead, Maya reached out and touched her arm gently. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Gable. Please, tell the kitchen staff that we'll be having a casual dinner tonight. I'd like everyone to take an early shift off. We've all had a difficult month." The staff looked at each other in stunned silence. She was still the same Maya, kind, observant, and thoughtful. Maya stood on the balcony. Maya stood on the balcony overlooking the vast estate. She watched the security teams patrolling the perimeter, but now, they reported to her as much as they did to Victor. She had used her new position to overhaul the safety protocols, ensuring that no one would ever get close enough to hurt Leo again. She had the power now, the power to protect, to provide, and to change the lives of everyone under this roof. Victor stepped out behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Is it everything you wanted?" he asked. Maya looked out at the horizon, then back at Leo, who was happily playing in the library behind them. She felt the weight of the diamond on her finger and the strength of the man holding her. She was no longer poor, and she was certainly no longer invisible. She had traded her green vest for a crown of responsibility, and she wore it with a grace that the elite could never understand. "It's more than I ever dreamed," Maya replied, leaning back against his chest. "I used to think my job was just to keep this house clean. Now I know my job is to keep this family whole." The girl who had once taken 3 bullets for a child she loved was now the most powerful woman in the city. And as the sun set over the Volkov Empire, everyone knew that while Victor was the boss, Maya was the heart that made the empire worth having.